In the 1820s, the British arrived in Arabia to end piracy. They then forced all of the sheikhs of the pirate coast to sign treaties with them, but these were often ignored by both sides. For instance, the British didn't want to get involved in wars with the Wahhabis, and the sheikhs continued to launch pirate raids. But then the Wahhabis were defeated, and in 1835, a group of ships from Abu Dhabi, Sharjah and the likes began once again to raid ships, particularly Omani ships. So the British attacked again, leaving the Arab fleets in ruins, and James Morrison created a sort of truce among the different rulers once again. Stolen property was returned and raids stopped for 6 months of the year, allowing the rulers to exploit the pearling season. This created a great deal of wealth for the sheikhs, so they renewed the alliance every year, then every 10 years, until, in 1853, the Treaty of Peace and Perpetuity was signed. The sheikhs received British protection and mediation, as well as wealth from trade. And, in return, they should prevent their subjects from raiding and launching pirate attacks. It is also worth noting that many of the sheikhs were often challenged for control, like Tanun bin Shakbut al-Nahyan, who ruled in Abu Dhabi from 1818 to 1833. He deposed his own brother into exile and signed the initial treaty with the British. But his brother returned in 1823 with an army of Bedouin soldiers. But Tanun won and chased his brother into Sharjah. There, Sultan bin Sakir al-Qasimi ruled from 1803 to 1866. He was sometimes a client of the Wahhabis, other times his rule was challenged by them. He would actually go to war with Abu Dhabi when their Bedouin allies raided his lands. So he sent hundreds of men to attack in 1833, but was chased back. He then settled on blockading the city with a couple dozen boats, while, around the same time, the people of Dubai began to assert their independence. Ubayd bin Said bin Rashid had led a few hundred men across the desert to the fishing village and created his own branch of the larger tribe, known as Al Maktoum. As ruler, he ruled over less than 1,000 people, but still he joined Sharjah in his wars against Abu Dhabi. As for Tanun, he would struggle for control of land, like the oasis town of Buraimi, which Oman and the Wahhabis both wanted. But he was deposed by his brother Khalifa, who tried to form an alliance with the Wahhabis. He in turn though was murdered in 1845 and replaced by his nephew Said. Said would then take Buraimi back from the Wahhabis with the help of Oman. So you can see in this environment, many rulers were happy to seek British mediation and protection. As for Bahrain nearby, their situation was even more complicated. Many of the British in India didn't want to expand the same protection to them, as they were usually involved in larger conflicts. And one place Bahrain was trying to expand into was Qatar. I haven't really mentioned much on Qatar, and that's largely because there were very few people living there. Plus, even in many of the treaties, the British just believed that it was a client of Bahrain. The British did actually launch an attack on Qatar in 1821 to end their pirate raids. During this, they bombarded Al-Bida, which today is in Doha. Qatar would then be attacked by Bahrain because in 1828, Mohammed bin Khamis, the ruler of the Al-Buainin tribe, murdered a Bahraini man. But first, even though you're all now enjoying some history online, nothing can truly beat the feeling of a historic document in your hands or upon your wall. That's why I'm proud to announce that the sponsor of this video is Historic Mail. This is a service dedicated to connecting you to great events of history through the lost art of letter writing. The concept is easy. Every week an envelope will arrive at your door, and inside is a beautiful reproduction of a letter written by an important historical figure, along with a document providing context and a typed version for easy reading. These come from a huge range of historical eras, from the American Revolution to Churchill's love letters to Clementine. So imagine, if you will, receiving a letter every week from your favourite historical people, stamped and delivered to your doorstep. Or maybe, if you know another history buff out there, this will be a fantastic gift this Christmas. This will give you or them a beautiful addition to your room and a more personal understanding of the people involved in history's most important events. For instance, in the letters between Churchill and Roosevelt, you can truly see the importance of the special relationship between their two countries. Or one of my favourites is Walt Disney's letter to the then Vice President Nixon requesting an interview. With Historic Mail you can get 10 weekly letters for $59.99, or there's another option for 25 letters or 52 letters if you'd like to explore history for a whole year. And if you do get them as a gift, they will come with a certificate
with your name on to make it even more personal. So this holiday season, surprise your history-loving friends and family with this timeless gift. And you can even get 10% off on all of their products with their Christmas sale. Just go to historicmail.com/jabzy to get your gifts now, and of course, support the channel. For now, let's get straight back to the video.
Bahraini troops were able to remove him from power, but Al-Bida and nearby Doha then became the home of many outlaws and pirates, like Jassim bin Jabir. The British demanded that this pirate be handed over, but the town refused. So, once again, they were bombarded in 1841. In the aftermath, the towns, which only ever had a few hundred people living there, were occupied by Isa bin Tarif. He was the ruler of the small Al bin Ali tribe, and initially was loyal to the Al Khalifa of Bahrain. But the Al Khalifa were having their own problems. For starters, they contended with the Wahhabis over another town in Qatar, known as Zubarah. This is where the Caliphs a century ago had moved to and set sail to take over Bahrain. But it was then taken over by the Wahhabis in 1809, and when they retreated, Said of Oman attacked and torched the settlement. The town began to be repopulated again in the 1820s, and Bahrain sent someone over to govern it. This was Abdullah bin Ahmad al Khalifa. He, however, decided to unsuccessfully start a rebellion and declare his independence and loyalty to the Wahhabis. So the peninsula would again be attacked by Bahrain, and then when the Wahhabis were taken over by the Egyptians, they too tried to move into Qatar next. But the Al Nuaym tribe, which lived near the town of Zubarah, refused to pay tribute to the Egyptians in 1840. In all of this chaos, a man known as Izn bin Tarif of the Al bin Ali tribe formed an alliance with the rebellious Bahraini Abdullah bin Ahmad. Together they rebelled, but soon Isa bin Tarif was forced to flee to Abu Dhabi. There he made a strange alliance with the ruler of Oman, and even stranger, he sent ships to help Oman capture Mombasa in Africa in 1837. Isa then moved back to Qatar and struggled once again for dominance. By this time though, the Egyptians had left Arabia, and the ruler of Bahrain, Mohammed bin Khalifa, sent troops once again to Qatar in 1847. The British didn't support this action, but still he pushed on, and won the Battle of Fuwayrit. During the battle, Isa bin Tarif was killed, and a new group moved into Doha and took power, known as the Thani. They belonged to the much larger Banu Tamim tribe that came to Qatar in the 1720s. They first lived in the south but slowly moved north, until the Thanis took over Doha. Here they would actually cement their control, and they continue to rule Qatar today. Mohammed bin Khalifa meanwhile refused to pay tribute to the resurgent Wahhabis, so the Saudis formed an alliance with Mohammed bin Thani and attacked, forcing Khalifa and the Bahrainis to pay tribute once again. The Wahhabis, you may see, fight a lot of wars just for tribute, and there's a good reason for this. 1/5 of their income came from raids, but these were slowing down. Pilgrim fees and zakat helped their economy a lot, but largely they were dependent on tribute from these neighbouring rulers. In the Gulf states, there was some more back and forth over the next couple years. Like the Bahrainis blockaded Doha in 1852, the Wahhabis provided sanctuary to Bahraini claimants, and the two nations were poised to go to war again. So in 1861, the British finally signed an alliance with Bahrain, rather than risk the Wahhabis taking the island. They promised to defend the island and recognised that Qatar is dependent on them. The British also recognised that Mohammed bin Thani was the governor of Qatar, but he also had to pay tribute to the Wahhabis, so he was sort of stuck in the middle. These treaties, though, also came with many conditions, like slavery should have come to an end, and now Bahrain was part of the Trucal states. The Wahhabis continued to try to assert their authority in these territories, but were largely unsuccessful. They also tried to demand that Oman fall back under their control. This country, though, had long been an ally of Britain. However, Said bin Sultan had shipped his whole court off to Zanzibar to govern over the colonies. These were of course far richer thanks to the slave trade, but it left Oman proper as a weakening state. Then when Said died in 1856, his sons began to fight one another for control of the empire. The British once again stepped in to mediate. They created 2 states for his 2 sons, one in Oman and one in Zanzibar. Tuwaini bin Said, the new ruler of Oman, should have received tribute from his brother each year, but this often wasn't paid. And even Oman proper was divided within itself. This is because it was technically the Sultanate of Muscat along the coast and Oman in the interior. So the country would never again achieve the same level of power that Said once had, and they would continue to fall under British influence. The British were also expanding into Yemen as well, but I should stress that most of this expansion was not conducted by the British government in London, but rather the governors of India. So there was sort of a situation in which the British had an empire within an empire. Here they had already taken over Aden, but soon found opportunity to expand. In 1839, one of their ships crashed, and before it fell beneath the sea, Arab tribesmen boarded and plundered it. The British captain in the region demanded compensation, but when this failed, he bombarded the town of Aden. The British at this point only had a small strip of land, which was surrounded by the larger Sultanate of Lahej. But after this, they forced the Sultan out of Aden itself, in return for annual payments, and he was also forced to accept British protection. There were attempts to kick the British out later that year, but they were quickly repulsed. 9 tribes around Aden were also forced into concluding similar alliances, putting the British firmly in control of the now booming port city. This greatly worried the Ottomans, who finally decided to return to Yemen. They still technically owned the province, but left years ago, when the Shia Zaydi rose up. These Zaydis had also lost a great deal of power themselves, but they still held on to the city of Sana'a. So to counter the growing British threat, the Ottomans sent troops south in 1849, and began to try to reassert their control. Their attacks on Sana'a were initially driven back, but by 1872 they were able to succeed and create the Yemen Vilayet. The timing here was particularly crucial, as up in Egypt, the Suez Canal was under construction, and Yemen would become a strategic base. In Egypt though, after surrendering control of the Levant, Muhammad Ali continued to rule up until 1848. In his final years he turned Egypt's attention southwards once more, and took over Massawa and Eritrea in 1846. But by this point he was growing ill and senile. Plus his long wars, modernization efforts and empire building had left the country in debt. But many people were too scared to tell him. The country was in fact 80 million francs in debt, and there was no real sign of turning this around initially. His son Ibrahim became regent when it was clear that Muhammad Ali could no longer rule. But he died shortly afterwards, and Muhammad Ali died a couple months later. Abbas I, Muhammad's grandson, and Ibrahim's nephew took over next. He, however, has often been criticised by historians for reversing many of the reforms made by his predecessors. He inherited many huge infrastructure projects like the Delta Barrage. This was supposed to improve irrigation in the country, but construction was pretty disastrous, and the cost of it spiraled to £3 million. So Abbas, hoping just to end construction quickly, allegedly came up with a bold plan. The French engineers that were working on it reported he said, "Those great masses of stones, the pyramids are standing there useless. Why not take the stone from them to do the work?" Otherwise, he was just largely opposed to foreign influence in the country, whether it was investment or trade. So during his rule, many foreigners left and exports reduced drastically. The only real project he allowed was when he contacted Robert Stevenson to construct a railway line from Alexandria to Cairo. The first branch was opened in 1854, so Egypt had trains before the Portuguese, Swedish and Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, by the way, built their first train line in 1860, running from Izmir to Aden. Abbas did aid the Ottomans in their war with Russia, but largely kept to his palace life and mistreated his slaves. In one story, he nailed hot horseshoes to his horse grooms, and the mistreatment of those in his court actually ended his life, as he was killed by one of his slaves in 1854. He was succeeded by his uncle Said Pasha, in a move welcomed by many foreigners. He had been educated in France and was more welcoming of foreign influence. So while there were only 3,000 foreigners in Egypt during the reign of Abbas, in a couple of decades there were nearly 100,000. He quickly granted land to French businessman Ferdinand de Lesseps to begin construction on the Suez Canal. He used state funds to invest in this project himself, but he also borrowed huge sums of money from French banks. Some of these were as high as £11.9 million with a 9% interest rate. Some of this money was also spent on his own court, which was described as incredibly lavish. And to make matters worse, he lost a great deal of revenue from the slave trade, which the Europeans pressured him to ban. So now Sudan, which had been conquered just to acquire slaves, was more of a burden to the state than a benefit. Somewhat fortunately for Said though, the American Civil War broke out, and Europeans began to suffer from a cotton famine. British and French investors then began arriving in Egypt, hoping to develop their cotton industry to replace the American one. This, of course, brought in some wealth to the country, and after the war, many Confederate plantation owners were actually welcomed into Egypt as well. Some Confederates, like William Wing Loring, would actually serve in the Egyptian armies in their wars against Ethiopia. But, again, further infrastructure was needed to export the crop, and many more loans were taken out. Internationally, Said was a Francophile, and strangely joined Napoleon III in his invasion of Mexico. Sudanese troops who Napoleon believed would be better suited to the climate of Mexico were shipped off, and they generally impressed their French commanders. As one said, "Spirit does not permit them to allow any prisoner to live." Their bravery was amazing. Incredibly, they were not men but lions. Said would die in 1863 and was replaced by Ismail. He was another man that was educated in Paris, and another ruler that would continue getting the country into even more debt. And it was this debt that would eventually see the British move in. Nearby though, Tunisia was also falling into more debt as well. The Husainid dynasty still ruled over the country, and rulers like Ahmad I began to turn more towards Europe. New ministries were created, slavery was abolished, and a military academy was created as well. Also, despite helping the Ottomans in the Crimean War, the French negotiated the end of the payment of tribute to Constantinople. His successor, Muhammad II, granted freedoms to all religious groups. This largely came about because of the Bateau Sefers affair, when, in 1857, a Jewish cart driver knocked over and killed a Muslim boy. He was then executed for blasphemy after allegedly insulting Islam as well. He was beheaded and his head was kicked through the streets, causing once again international outrage. Napoleon III led the charge, sending ships to Tunisia to force Muhammad II to make reforms. The Fundamental Pact was then signed, bringing equality to all religions. It should be said though that especially in Tunisia, there was a growing number of intellectuals that advocated for sweeping changes, and some of them, like Mahmoud Kabadou, were Islamic scholars. He would argue that Islam and science were not opposed to one another, and the decline of the Islamic world was because Muslims had ignored the study of the natural world for centuries. Other reformers came from the military, many of which were former Mamluks, or had been students in Europe. These were the early followers of Islamic modernism. They would continue to pop up across the Islamic world, like Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India and Rifa at-Tatawi in Egypt. Muhammad III, the next ruler of Tunisia, filled his government with many of these modernists, and introduced the first constitution in the Arab world in 1861. Muhammad III would then embark on huge construction projects, rejuvenating cities and the likes. The French were also given many concessions, like to construct telegraph lines. And through it all, like with Egypt, the country was falling more and more into debt. French and British banks loaned huge sums of money to these countries with huge interest rates. So to try and balance their budget, the currency was debased, and then the poll tax was doubled. This poll tax beforehand was already high, the equivalent of 45 days of labour on average. And to make matters worse for the poor people, conscription had been introduced. Plus remember that this conscription was into an army which many people didn't really have much affiliation with. Whereas the Europeans had cultivated ideas of nationalism through wars, propaganda and the likes, the Islamic countries were forcing many separatists and Bedouin tribesmen into their armies. And the governments of these countries, like in the case of Tunisia, were filled with foreigners, like former Mamluks, Turks and even Europeans. For instance, the Prime Minister at this point was a man named Mustafa Kaznadar. He was a Greek man that was enslaved during their wars of independence and sold to Tunisia. He would prove to be incredibly unpopular at this time. So once the poll tax was increased, people rebelled around El Kef and proceeded onto towns like Beja and Safax. They found a new leader in Ali Ben Gadahem, who was called the People's Bey, and many of the tribes flocked to join in. They hoped to restore their traditional rights, and in some towns, they shouted "Down with the Mamluks" and "Long live the Ottoman Sultan." For many, therefore, the Sultan was still seen as the ruler of their nation, the Caliph almost. The current rulers of Tunisia were just foreigners, delivering the country into the hands of the Europeans. The rebels also made demands which included the implementation of Sharia, restoration of the slave trade, and no special protection for foreigners. To try and calm the situation, the poll tax was replaced with a more progressive tax. Britain, France and Italy also sent ships to the coast, all to make sure that the other nation didn't exploit the situation. The European nations also began to have talks with the rebels, but couldn't really end the fight. Instead, it was the Ottomans who landed troops in Tunis. They hoped to bring the country back into the fold like they had done with Libya, but the Tunisian government rejected their demands to pay tribute and return under their control once again. So the Ottomans and all the Europeans departed, to leave the Bey to deal with the rebels himself. He recruited a couple thousand Algerians and marched south. Some tribal leaders were bribed to leave the rebellion, others began to fight one another. The Tunisian army then dealt with the rebels particularly brutally. Their leaders were hanged or shot. Some were chained up and marched through the deserts to the capital in order to be tortured. And to make sure the government could actually pay off the debt, rebel areas were expected to pay huge sums of money. This burden was, as always, passed down to the people, who had to sell their property and farms. People's livestock and possessions were also taken back to the capital, and many people who didn't pay up could risk being tortured or having their wives publicly assaulted. People decided to cut down their olive and date trees or destroy their farms, because not having anything was better than working in order to hand everything over. All of this helped cause a famine, and the people also suffered from an outbreak of plague and typhoid as well. Many turned to cannibalism, banditry was commonplace, whole towns were left largely abandoned, and provinces were left producing nothing. So, in the end, the country fell further into debt. There would be another rebellion in 1867, but again, many were killed, including high-ranking officials Mohammed just didn't trust. And at the end of all this, it would be the Tunisian debt that would eventually see the French arrive in the country. Meanwhile, on either side of Tunisia, the Ottomans and French struggled with rebels of their own. In Libya, which the Ottomans had just taken over again, they had to contend with the Senussi order in the south, while in Algeria, the French only held on to coastal towns. In the interior, the rebels had created the Emirate of Abd el-Qadir, which halted French expansion further south by 1837. Abd el-Qadir had consolidated his power and built up an army by recruiting local tribes under his control. He also created a pretty effective administration in the desert region, and many have praised him for being chivalrous when dealing with captured enemies. But the French then broke the peace agreement and sent General Bugeaud to lead the advance. He declared, "I will enter into your mountains, I will burn down your villages and your harvests, I will cut down your fruit trees." So, as you would expect, the following campaigns were brutal. While the Algerians launched guerrilla attacks on French columns, the French would employ scorched earth tactics, burning down villages and farms, driving people deep into the desert. Even Abd el-Qadir was forced to move into Morocco to continue the fight. Sultan Abd al-Rahman had long supported his fellow Muslims against the French, providing them with weapons and refuge. So, in 1844, the French struck at the Moroccans on land at the Battle of Isly and bombarded Tangier and Mogador from the sea. This Franco-Moroccan war was remarkably quick. The Moroccans were forced to accept French control over Algeria, demarcate their border, and stop funding the Algerians. Abd el-Qadir was still able to achieve some victories, like at Sidi Barrim in 1845. But now, even within Morocco, he was an outlaw. Abd al-Rahman sent assassins to try and kill him, and an army to attack his base at Oued Aslaf in 1847. Unable to constantly fight in Morocco and Algeria, he made peace. The emirate was destroyed, and Abd el-Qadir left for the Levant, where he would open his doors to Christians during the Damascus riots. The French continued on their march south very slowly. Like in 1852, they took over the town of Lagoat and massacred much of the population. In fact, this siege was one of the first times where chemical weapons were used on a civilian population. Even Alexis de Tocqueville reported, "We are far more barbaric than the Arabs themselves. These days, they represent civilization." However, pinning down the number of dead during all of these wars is incredibly difficult. But in some cases, the French did wipe out entire tribes. Like the Ouledria tribe fled into the Dara Mountains in 1845. There they hid in caves, hoping the French would pass by. But General Pélissier decided to smoke them out, and hundreds of people died of asphyxiation inside the caves. One hero of Algerian resistance I should mention is Lala Fatman Unsouma. She was born in Kabylie lands, which is along the coast, but up in the mountains, where the French couldn't get her. She led many of the Kabylie tribesmen in battle against the French from 1849 until she was captured in 1857. Or there was the tribe Oulad Sidi Shaikh. They initially worked alongside the French, but then rebelled around Oran. They did this to largely stop the work of the Arab Bureau, which would put Frenchmen among the tribes under the veil of civilizing them. But really, they just acted as spies and tried to undermine their autonomy. By the 1880s, Sheikh Bouamama led the tribe in resistance as they were driven south. In 1881, they worked alongside the Tuaregs to attack the Flatters expedition, which tried to find a route for the Trans-Saharan Railroad. But in the end, Sheikh Bouamama was forced into exile as well. The entire process of pacifying all of Algeria would take a couple more decades, but the French were now firmly in control of Algeria. Across the border, over in Morocco, many began to see Abd al-Rahman as a weak leader, capitulating to the Europeans. Some tribes even rose up in 1844, while others, far out of control of the central government, launched raids across the border. Then, in 1851, a French ship docked in Salé. Here, the locals plundered the ship, and the French wanted compensation. The Moroccans gave them nothing though, so the French once again bombarded a Moroccan port city. As the country began to weaken and break down, many groups began to act independently. Like in the north, the Riffians would be involved in a number of clashes with the Europeans. They are a group of Berbers who began to engage in some piracy. Like in 1852, they fired at a Prussian ship, and the Prussians returned in 1856 to try and seek revenge. They engaged the Riffians at the Battle of Tres-Forcasse, but withdrew, having not really gained a victory. The Riffians also began attacking the Spanish colonies in the north, almost on an annual basis in the 1840s. The Spanish demanded a strip of land almost as a buffer to stop the raids, and also compensation. But the new Sultan of Morocco, Mohammed IV, refused. He was actually more of a reformer than his predecessors, especially when it came to the army, as he sent troops to train abroad. But they could do nothing to stop the Spanish. Tangier was once again bombarded, and over 30,000 Spaniards marched south on land. After losing a couple of battles, Mohammed made peace, giving the Spanish little bits of land in the north, and a colony in the south, which would eventually transform into Western Sahara. But more importantly, he was forced to pay war indemnities to the Spanish. This was the equivalent of 20 times their annual budget, so they would cripple the country. The British stepped in to give them a loan, and they had already signed a treaty with Morocco in 1856, opening the country up to trade. But now the Moroccans would have to hand over half of their income on tariffs to British banks. This would continue for a very long time, as the loan would only be paid back in the 1880s. Yet there was really no other option for the Moroccans. So despite Mohammed IV's reforms, this loss to Spain almost made Morocco a completely feudal nation. To collect taxes to pay off the loans, he sent qaids out into the tribes. These men were usually noted for their ability to brutalize people and crush rebellions. But in reality, the qaids began to act as independent rulers, as many of the tribes did. So the Europeans were on the advance in the Middle East. But this would be more noticeable further east, where the Russians had finally taken control of the Caucasus. But from very early on they began to slaughter the people and torch their villages. As General Yermolov wrote, "We need the Circassian lands, but we don't have any need for the Circassians themselves." Other commanders like Grigory Zas considered the Circassians to be a lower race, and he would just randomly kill any he found. Some were burned alive for fun, and Zas allegedly kept their body parts under his bed. These campaigns against the Circassians intensified in the 1860s, when Alexander II was Tsar. He endorsed the idea of ethnic cleansing in the Caucasus, in order to create a Russian settler colony. The order was then given to deport the Circassians to the Ottoman Empire, but on the ground, massacres still took place. The Circassians appealed to the Ottomans and the British for help, and both promised to recognize a Circassian state should it be created. However, this just encouraged the Russians to move in quickly, and no help came to the Circassians. Reports indicate that mountains would be littered with corpses, being eaten by wild dogs, and rivers flowed red with blood. To even pay for the trip across the sea, some sold themselves into slavery. Many of the ships were overloaded and capsized. Turkish captains brutalized the passengers, and diseases spread. Then, on arrival, the refugees had very little support. The Ottoman government then decided to send many of them into the mountainous regions of Anatolia to work in difficult jobs. One of the leaders of the resistance in the Caucasus was Imam Shamil. Well, one of his sons wrote, "The Turks triggered the resettlement by their proclamations, probably hoping to use refugees for military ends. But after facing the avalanche of refugees, they turned turtle and shamefully condemned to slow death those people who were ready to die for Turkey's glory." So those that did survive were sent into the mountains of Anatolia, or even the Middle East, where they would create the city of Amman in the 1880s. But many others were also used as a political tool. They were sent to Christian areas, where the Ottomans hoped that they would be a counter to the growing independence movements. In total, 250,000 were sent to the Balkans, where they would make up over 5% of the population. But they weren't the only recent arrivals from Russia, as there were a growing number of Crimean Tatars fleeing the empire and arriving in Ottoman lands as well. 100,000 of them were also sent to the Balkans. The strain these new arrivals placed on the regions could be one of the causes of the wave of independence wars there, and, tragically, many would also have to face the Russians again in the 1877 war. The Russians also continued expanding into Central Asia with their Kievan campaign, striking deep into modern-day Uzbekistan. They had long had their eye on the region, hoping to gain more lands and to stop slave raids. After all, many Russians living on the frontier and even fishermen on the Caspian Sea were still being enslaved and sold in Kievan markets, alongside many Persians. So the Russians moved on Khiva, but it was a disaster. The Central Asian steppe produced very little food at the best of times, and the Russians attacked in the winter of 1839, a remarkably harsh one. Over 1,000 camels and hundreds of Russian men died en route, forcing them to retreat. They would come back to the region just a couple decades later, but this expedition encouraged the British to strengthen their northern border even more and create a puppet in Afghanistan. Here, Dost Muhammad Khan had been consolidating his power and entered into the international game of diplomacy. But he still relied on a feudal system to build an army, and much of the country, including Herat and Kandahar, lay outside of his control. Nevertheless, Lord Auckland in India was determined to create a permanent ally out of the country. So he formed the Army of the Indus and planned on invading to put the deposed Durrani king, Shuja Shah, on the throne. Over 20,000 men marched through Quetta into Kandahar, and then, in July 1839, they took Ghazni. But Shuja was already a cruel leader, chopping off the body parts of his servants, and when he was presented with captured men, he had them executed brutally, angering both the British and many of the locals. Nevertheless, this army then entered Kabul unopposed, and Shuja was placed on the throne, where he continued to execute and torture. Dost Muhammad fled to Bukhara, but he had annexed their lands just a few years before, so he was imprisoned. He still refused to surrender though and escaped, while many of his governors continued to resist, like Mir Wali of Kulum. Most of their armies were defeated though, so Dost Muhammad surrendered in 1840. But the reason behind his surrender is disputed. Some say he believed British success was inevitable, others say he wanted to save his family who were in British custody. Then there was also the threat of Herat joining the British, or, more likely, he suspected his allies were about to betray him. Whatever the case may be, he accepted exile in India. Some British troops stayed in Kabul to defend Shuja, but the officers began to make themselves very unpopular by building lavish homes and the likes. Meanwhile, over in the west, Britain and Russia began to enter talks concerning the events in Egypt. They also brought up Afghanistan though, hoping to make their spheres of influence official. Although many Brits accepted this, Palmerston believed that the Great Game should continue, as Britain had more money to bribe and influence local rulers than Russia did. And the Great Game also kept Russian troops occupied in the east, far away from Europe. In general though, holding on to Afghanistan seemed more and more unnecessary now, as tensions had cooled. Many Afghans also continued to join in the resistance, some out of anger, others more to do with money. This is because on the way the British had paid for the loyalty of some tribes, like the Ghazis, but they began to reduce those subsidies, prompting many to join the resistance. And Shuja continued to be so unpopular that many of his own ministers began to defect. In late 1841, tensions grew worse because a slave girl that belonged to a Pashtun fled to the home of Alexander Burns, a man who had been in Afghanistan for a while. The locals then discovered that he had slept with the girl, so angry tribal leaders held a secret meeting and called for jihad. They found a leader in Akbar Khan, Dost Muhammad's son, and began to riot. Burns was killed while the British soldiers did nothing, allegedly not wanting to escalate the situation. Shuja tried to quell the rebellion himself, but his soldiers were crushed in battle. Many more Brits were killed, including those that went to go meet with Akbar to discuss peace. Therefore, General Elphinstone had, through his own incompetence, long lost control of the situation, and he agreed to leave Afghanistan in early 1842. He asked for safe passage for his thousands of men, and they marched back home. But their supplies were stolen, and they endured numerous ambushes. Elphinstone then made another disastrous mistake. He handed over British women to Akbar in return for those same supplies that had been stolen. But these women were just taken, and there were even more ambushes. Only a few people were taken as prisoners, with the rest, excluding a couple people, were killed in the mountains. And I should add, the British had tried to create a national army for Afghanistan for the first time. They joined the British on their retreat, but deserted. However, when they got back to Kabul, they were mutilated and left on the streets in poverty. As for Shuja Shah, he locked himself away in a fortress known as Bala Hissar, where he believed the rebels couldn't get him, but he was just assassinated inside its walls. There had also been other British forces in Afghanistan, like in Jalalabad and Kandahar. They were ordered to retreat, but they found bodies littering the mountains on their way back, and they wanted revenge. So in 1842 the Kabul expedition set off, and the British began torching villagers en route to the capital. They once again took Kabul pretty quickly and destroyed the main bazaar in the city. However, once this was done, they soon retreated, as this was a campaign of revenge. Once the British were out of the country, Dost Muhammad was brought back in, and quickly he wanted to consolidate his power once more. So he launched the Hazara Jat campaign in 1843, bringing Bamiyan Beshud and many Hazara tribes under his control. This freed him up to take Mazar-e-Sharif from Bukhara just a few years later. Dost Muhammad was also pretty lucky, as his longtime enemy, the Sikh Empire, was defeated by the British in 1849 and brought into British India. This obviously put Britain on his borders, but it did stop the frequent Sikh invasions. And also, fortunately for Dost Muhammad, troubles in other provinces allowed him to expand even more. Like in Herat, Kamran Shah, another Durrani prince, was deposed and murdered by his vizier, Yar Muhammad Khan. He belonged to the Alakozai tribe, and he spent much of his reign trying to expand his domains, attacking the Hazaras and launching campaigns in Maimana, Akcha and Chahar. Meanwhile in Kandahar, a different branch of Dost Muhammad's Baraksai tribe ruled. As Baraksai, they were related to Dost Muhammad, but had asserted their independence. And they, like Yar Muhammad Khan, began seeking the support from Persia, who themselves wanted to expand into their old territories. In 1851, Kandahar struck first, and sent troops into disputed lands. As they looked poised to strike at Herat itself, Yar Muhammad sent troops into disputed lands as well, but he died shortly afterwards. Strangely though, he died by eating a bad bowl of cucumbers and milk. His son Saeed Muhammad Khan took over just as the Kandahar armies invaded. But then, the Persians stepped in on behalf of Herat. They defeated Kandahar and occupied Herat for a few months. Saeed was still determined to root out any rivals within the city, so began to purge some of the most influential tribesmen in some pretty barbaric ways. Like one was beaten with sticks until his belly burst, and another had a crown of dough and boiling oil put on his head. But he was still largely under the control of Persia. Meanwhile, Dost Muhammad began to clash with Kohan Dil Khan of Kandahar. Although Kohan had managed to keep power, he died in 1855, and, as per usual, a succession war erupted. In 1855, as the city fell into anarchy, Dost Muhammad sent an army south to capture it, finally taking over the principality. In Herat, Saeed also took advantage of it by marching into Farah. But back home, he had lost his mind. As he executed more people in a state of madness, people revolted. He agreed to surrender in exchange for his life, but he was still executed. The rebels had turned to Muhammad Yusuf Zaruzai to lead the conspiracy, and as he was from the Zaruzai tribe, he was a Durrani noble. The Persians though quickly responded by invading in 1856, and Muhammad Yusuf, desperate for help, declared himself to be a British vassal and hoisted the Union Jack. However, he was betrayed and handed over to the Persians, who laid siege to the city. As many groups fought for power inside the walls, the Shia Hazara made plans to open the gates to the Persians. Isa Khan, who took power in the end, found out about the plan and massacred them. Nevertheless, the Persians were able to breach the walls and enter, and they executed the new Shah. However, this assault on the city angered the British. They argued that the Persians had violated past treaties and gave them a cause for war. The British sailed their navy straight into the Persian Gulf and landed at Bushire and took the city without a fight. But the Shah still refused to surrender, so the British set sail again, this time to Mohamira, where they once again found the Persians retreating without a fight. The Shah therefore was forced to surrender and signed the Treaty of Paris in 1857. But had the Persians held out for a little longer, they could have actually had some success, as the Sepoy Mutiny in India would break out later that year. But Persia agreed to leave Herat and put Muhammad Yusuf back on the throne. However, Muhammad Yusuf was handed over to his enemies in Herat and executed. This is because the Persians still had other plans, as a nephew of Dost Muhammad had come to them asking for help. His name was Sultan Ahmad Khan, and he wanted to take over Afghanistan on Persia's behalf. And despite many plots, he actually held on to power in Herat for quite a while. However, he was still largely surrounded by Dost Muhammad, as during the Anglo-Persian Wars, he moved into Farah. Well, in 1862, the new Persian puppet of Herat tried to move into Farah himself. But Dost Muhammad responded by attacking Herat and finally united Afghanistan. There would be some places outside of his control, like the Maimana Khanate, but this would fall in 1875 when Sher Ali Khan was ruler. He then massacred most of the population, devastating a once powerful trading city. But just to go back a bit in time to that Sepoy Mutiny and the end of the Mughal Empire. Their emperor had long lived in a palace in Delhi, controlling nothing of note. But in the 1850s, Indian soldiers mutinied. They were angry about a lot of things. Some say it was because the British were making them bite cartridge papers covered in pork and cow fat, but this was just a rumour. The true rulers of the rebellion are far more complicated. Some Hindus, for instance, were angry that the colonizers were allowing people from outside the warrior caste to join their army. Others didn't like being sent on overseas expeditions to places like Arabia, and of course missionary work and British rule angered many more. So they mutinied and the rebellion quickly spread. They declared the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah as the ruler of India, as they captured important cities like Delhi. Luckily for the East India Company though, they still had many allies, like the Sikhs and the Gurkhas, who helped them reassert control. And also, some Islamic scholars also rejected calling for jihad against the British, like Sayyid Nazir Hussain. He, like many others, didn't really believe that British India was an abode of war or Dar el-Harb, as the Muslims were given freedom of religion. As the mutineers began to massacre the British population, the East India Company responded brutally by massacring civilians in recaptured towns. Many were bayoneted on the spot, many women were subject to all sorts of abuse, and captured rebels were executed by being tied to a cannon and blown up, a punishment that had been used by the Mughals, Shuja Shah and others. It's estimated that 150,000 were killed during the entire rebellion, most of which were civilians. But the rebellion made it clear that the East India Company was now incapable of ruling over such a large territory, especially given the atrocities they committed to maintain order. So the British government took over their lands. The new British Raj, though, largely kept their influence over the territories in Arabia, so much so that the Indian rupee would become the currency of many of the Arab states.